Good morning. Seem to have the desired response, sound effect. Okay, welcome to CAGE's Policy Day, part of a conference to mark the 10th year of CAGE. I'm Nick Krautz, I'm the director. I've been the director since the start. As a reward for good behaviour, I get to give up in a couple of months' time, so that's good. And centre will be in great hands because Mirko Draka is going to be my successor. You should wave to the audience, Mirko. Yeah. I've been privileged to be director since the start and for the 10 years that we've been going, and to have the pleasure of working with outstanding colleagues throughout those years. And we're going to meet several of those colleagues during the day. Just to introduce CAGE, if you're not familiar with us, we were conceived to carry out research relevant to what was at the time an ESRC strategic research challenge, succeeding in the global economy. We interpret success to involve not only economic growth, improving productivity and so on, but also very much thinking about well-being, achieving greater levels of well-being, etc. Our focus is definitely international rather than just UK-centric. We do research, and some will be on show today, which is published in top economics journals, but we always have an eye to impact. And this is part of our impact programme. Much of what we do, I think, could be described as being at the borders of mainstream economics. That's to say it involves interaction with other disciplines, most obviously political science, psychology, and so on. And I must say, given my own background, a distinctive feature of CAGE is that it takes economic history seriously and recognises its potential as an input into policy making. Okay, CAGE is organised in 4 themes. Each of them will have a session during the day on impact highlights from their research. Then, if you've glanced at the programme, in the middle of the day we'll have a keynote lecture by Nick Bloom. And we will also, after lunch, have a panel on productivity, competitive advantage and policy in the UK, which will be chaired by Dame Frances Cairncross. The aim of the day is just to increase awareness of some of the highlights of our research and to get some feedback, it says here, from a well-informed and sophisticated audience. That's your part of the proceedings, so don't let me down on that. Okay, we've got some really exciting work to review, and without more ado, I'm going to invite Professor Vera Troeger to introduce the Theme 4 session.
How do I get to the next presentation? Good morning, everybody. While our impact director, Michael, is helping me out with the more profane things of the day, I will introduce Theme 4. Say again. It's good? Yeah. Oh, it's there. Okay. So my name is Vera Troeger. I've joined the department in 2011 and joined CAGE. And in the second phase of funding, ESRC funding for the center, we decided together that it would be great to have an additional theme added to the CAGE portfolio. And this theme is exactly what you see here. So we added a theme that is more interdisciplinary in the sense that it combines different perspectives from economics, political economy, and quantitative political science on questions that have faced society in the last few decades, especially what are the implications of globalization and global crises for preference-building policy making, especially in Western democracies. Oops. Oh, I can't see this, but you can see this. Okay, that's great. Sorry, I was a bit... So As I said, over the last few decades, indeed, we have been faced with what's called globalization, and that comes, of course, in many different guises, market internationalization, ever greater integration. And this, of course, has affected how voters see policies, domestically and international, and that, of course, in turn affects how policymakers can cope with these constraints set domestically and internationally. So the research that is featured in theme 4 actually focuses on the effects that market integration has on Western democracies, on preference building and policy making. So we are looking at preferences towards globalization itself, but also preferences, attitudes towards welfare state policies, immigration, redistribution, and economic policy making. So as I said, methodologically, this theme offers a more interdisciplinary kind of political economy view on theoretical questions and uses the apparatus of quantitative, comparative, and international political economy to analyze the implications of these theoretical models. So, the theme 4 actually contributes to the whole CAGE research program, especially by contributing to the focal theme of managing change. And we focus specifically, as I said, on challenges generated by economic crisis, market integration, and globalization. We also, our research also contributes to the research challenge set by CAGE, succeeding in the global economy, by shedding light from different scholarly perspectives on questions like how preferences feed into policy making and how policy making feeds back into attitudes towards these kind of international challenges. There's a lot of policy relevant research generated in this theme, and I will talk about this in a minute a bit more. So this theme is basically organized in 3 sub-themes. Sub-theme 4.1 actually looks at preference building and how that is affected by internationalization and globalization. So we basically look how voter preferences change and adapt to these increased challenges of globalization. The globalization and market integration generates a whole lot of uncertainties, especially job security and other uncertainties that affect voters' demands for compensation, potential redistribution, but also potentially negative backlashes against immigration and tendencies towards populist policies. Of course, since preferences affect how policymakers actually think about what kind of policies will actually win them elections in the end, they will have to adapt to these shifts in preferences, and we are looking how policymakers actually respond to these shifts in preferences of voters. So, as I said, we are looking at these interlinked questions, how globalization affects individual preferences, how these changes in attitudes affect international developments and welfare state policies in advanced economies, and then how these policy choices feed back into individual perceptions of globalization and market integration. So we are trying here to link micro and macro views on this. So by looking at how individual preferences are formed and feed into the policymaking process, and then how this macro policymaking process feeds back into individual attitudes. A few of the major findings in this theme are, for example, Charlotte Cavalier's work on welfare chauvinism, and she shows that the question how governments provide social policies, so whether they are in kind or not, that can actually foster negative backlashes against immigration. And so specific social programs can foster these anti-immigration backlashes. David Roda over here will talk a little bit about his work in a second as one of the highlights of impact-generating work in this theme. But just to summarize, his work with Daniel Stegmüller actually challenges the common belief, especially in economics research, that cultural heterogeneity, so immigration and the share of immigrants in a society, reduce the support, especially of the poor for redistribution. What they actually show is that the differences in support for redistribution have much more to do with the differential altruism of the rich. And then very recent work from Lucy Barnes and Tim Hicks, who actually contributed to yesterday's research day in Theme 4. They show actually how voters form preferences over austerity and public borrowing, and how these voters actually don't really use household analogies to inform their judgment of government borrowing, but that elites actually use these cues to justify austerity much more. The second theme in theme 4, or the second theme, basically looks more like the policy impact of globalization and market integration. So the question really whether globalization will produce a race to the bottom in many policies, taxation, and so on, which might undermine European economies. So it's really the question that, everybody knows that trade is good for growth, but of course it generates redistributional conflicts. And really the question is how governments deal with these redistributional conflicts that are generated by this. If governments want to maintain popular support, and they have to, of course, if they want to stay in office, there's clearly no one-size-fits-all solution. And we analyze in this theme how there is this trade-off between domestic and international constraints, and how governments actually react to these demands that come from voter preferences, but international downward pressures to increase efficiency of policy making. So we really look at what kind of effect this has on mostly public good provision in Western democracies. And we ask these questions: what do governments seek to achieve? How do governments respond to domestic constraints, especially changes in voter preferences, and how there is this interaction effect between international and domestic constraints that affects domestic policy making. So we can observe general trends and reactions to globalization, but we also see that there are very specific domestic, institutional, and political contexts that actually frame policy making. So some of the major findings, so my work with Christina Schneider from UCSD actually looks at how governments try to increase pre-electoral consumption in order to increase re-election probabilities. And we show how fiscal constraints, especially visibility of deficit spending, so fiscal transparency, affects how governments actually, what tools governments use to increase their pre-electoral chances. I have other work with Thomas Plumper in this theme, and we basically show that really there's almost no correlation between how much is spent on specific welfare and social policies, and the desired outcomes like longevity, social mobility, and poverty, but it's much more the design of the welfare state policies that leads to better outcomes. The last theme, and I try to be quick, actually looks a little bit more globally, that what kind of combinations of policies can be successful and cope best with the challenges of globalization. So in the last few decades, there are quite often, especially also in the media, the welfare state was proclaimed dead. We can't observe this. Social spending has increased over time. Public good provision has increased over time in most Western democracies. But there is, of course, downward pressure on taxation, especially corporate taxation, due to tax competition and so on. So, of course, governments face different institutional constraints and have different policy tools at their disposal to actually affect or deal with these challenges. And this theme actually looks at what combinations of these policies help the welfare state to survive. So Iverson and Soskis have actually just published a book, and they show how, for example, coordinated market economies can compensate for high levels of redistribution by increasing international competitiveness with certain labor market institutions. So corporatism in Germany, the combination of strong unions and high investment in vocational training and these kind of things. And there's some other research by myself and my co-author Thomas. And we show actually that it really depends on how welfare states try to redistribute, whether it's through the tax system or through social security contributions, and how that heavily impacts their ability to decrease pre-tax inequality. And then something that generated quite a lot of impact lately is kind of an example how social policy is designed. And that's co-authored work with Maria Elisa Epifanio and Tom Scotto. And we actually look specifically at the generosity of maternity leave policies and how this impacts productivity, career speed, and income, and therefore also the gender pay gap in high-skilled sectors especially. So this is kind of summarizing what we have done so far in this theme. And I'm now introducing David Troeger from Nuffield College in Oxford, who will give a more specific example of how research done in this theme generates impact.